March 14th, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The sun was dropping low over the Texas plains when it happened, painting the dust in gold and blood orange. The wind blew warm across the barbed wire, rattling the tin roofs of the guard shacks and carrying the scent of mesquite and distant cattle. Evening roll call had just ended. Prisoners were returning to their barracks, guards settling into their quiet routines, the camp humming with the low, familiar sounds of boots on gravel and pots clattering in the mess hall. And then everything stopped. Anna Keller froze first. She had been walking with the other German women toward the laundry shed when a shadow fell across the fence. Private Samuel Carter, tall, sunburned, Stetson pushed back on his head, stood there. His hand shook slightly as he pressed something through the wires, something small, something shining faintly in the dying light. A ring made from aircraft aluminum. For a moment, Anna simply stared at it, her breath locked in her throat. She had seen aircraft aluminum before, twisted, burning, falling from the sky, but never shaped gently, never polished, never held out to her by an American soldier whose voice trembled when he whispered her name. Miss Keller. Here. She didn't take it. She didn't speak. She only stared, wide-eyed as if the object were a sin, a trap, a piece of forbidden magic placed in her palm by mistake. Carter swallowed, hard. This is for you. He was a cowboy before the war. He had fought bulls and droughts and long, lonely seasons on the ranch, but none of that had ever made his hands shake like this. He shouldn't have been here. He shouldn't have made it, and he certainly shouldn't have been reaching through a military fence to give it to a German prisoner. But he did. And Anna, enemy of the United States, daughter of the Reich, sworn member of the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps, felt her knees weaken. She had survived bombings, hunger, capture, and the long, humiliating voyage across the Atlantic. Yet nothing had prepared her for this. The sight of an American soldier, a man she was raised to hate, offering her a ring like a secret carried too long. Why, she whispered. Carter didn't answer. He just held her gaze, blue meeting gray across the wire, and in that suspended moment, the world shrank to the space between their hands. To understand the shock of that moment, one must understand the world that existed beyond the fence. In 1945, Europe was collapsing. Cities were burning. Mothers stood in bread lines stretching for blocks. German soldiers were surrendering by the tens of thousands, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Berlin was weeks from falling apart entirely. Every German prisoner arriving in America carried hunger carved into their bones and fear stitched into their uniforms. But America was something else entirely. This was the America of the greatest generation, a country roaring at full industrial power. In 1944 alone, the United States had produced more than 96,000 aircraft, more metal and machinery than the Axis could dream of. Trains packed with grain, beef, and canned goods crossed the nation every day. Cities glowed with electricity. The war had taken sons, but it had also poured life into factories, farms, and families pulling together with a unity the world had never seen. It was a land of ration books, but full plates. And because of that abundance, because America could produce beyond its needs, German prisoners in Texas were fed better than many German civilians at home. Many of the women arriving at Camp Hearn had not tasted real meat in months. They expected cruelty, hard labor, beatings. What they found instead was a full bowl of chili. Warm bread, coffee, a bed with clean sheets, and guards who said things like, "Yes, ma'am," as if that were the most natural thing in the world. For Anna, the contrast was unbearable. She had been taught her entire life, Americans torture prisoners. Americans are monsters. Americans have no honor. Yet here, just hours after stepping off the truck, a cowboy had handed her a canteen when she stumbled. "You okay, ma'am?" he'd said. Ma'am. As if she mattered. Later, another guard had helped her carry blankets to the barracks. And now, one of them was offering her a ring. It wasn't even a proper ring. It was crude, hand-filed, shaped in secret during late-night shifts. But that made it worse. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't casual. It was something he had spent time on. Something he had made because he thought of her when he shouldn't have. Anna's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Behind her, one of the German women gasped softly. Another whispered, "Are they mad? They will shoot him." Someone else murmured, "He must be mocking her." But Carter's face held no mockery, only fear and softness, and something dangerously close to tenderness. The impossible scene unfolded in silence, a prisoner trembling, a guard trembling more, the wire fence between them sparkling like a warning in the light. America kept prisoners well fed, but it also kept its discipline sharp. Every guard knew the rule: no fraternization, no gifts, no personal contact. Certainly no rings. If anyone saw this, Carter could lose his stripes, lose his career, maybe lose his freedom. And yet he stood there. "For you," he repeated quietly, his voice rough. Anna finally lifted her hand. Slowly, hesitantly, as if expecting the ring to burn her. She touched the aluminum with shaking fingers. It was warm from his palm, warm like something alive. She didn't take it. She couldn't. Not yet. But the moment she touched it, Carter let out a breath he'd been holding. Around them, the camp sounds resumed. The clang of pots, distant voices, boots crunching on gravel. But everything felt altered, as if the world had noticed and was pretending not to. "Watch." Anna stepped back, unable to hold his gaze. Her chest tightened with a feeling she hadn't known in years, something between terror and yearning. How could this be? Here, in this strange land, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, had she just seen humanity staring back at her through the eyes of a man raised to defeat her? Was this kindness real? Was it a trick? Was it something worse? Hope? She didn't know. But she knew one thing: nothing in her life had prepared her for this. Behind the fence, Carter lowered his hand, the ring still resting on the wire. His shoulders rose and fell once, as if the act itself had cost him something enormous. Anna walked away, but every few steps she looked back, unable to stop herself. The dust swirled around her ankles, catching the light. Her heart throbbed painfully, trying to understand what had just happened. A guard offering water was one thing. A polite, "Yes, ma'am," was another. But a ring. A ring was a promise. A declaration, a break in the wall between enemy and human. And it was the last thing she expected to find in America. The last thing anyone would expect. The last thing the world, burning across the ocean, would believe could happen here. Yet at Camp Hearn, Texas, where the sun set on a land of abundance and contradictions, a cowboy guard had just offered a German prisoner the one gesture more shocking than cruelty, more disarming than hatred. He offered her kindness. He offered her something dangerously close to love. The ring changed everything. Not because she took it, she didn't, but because both of them knew the moment it touched her fingers, a line had been crossed. A line drawn not in ink or regulation, but in wartime expectation, in the heavy weight of what soldiers owed their nation. For the next several days, neither of them spoke of it. They barely spoke at all. But the silence was not distance. It was tension, tightly coiled and humming. Anna often worked as a translator for the camp administration. Her English was better than most of the women's. Careful but steady, shaped by years of listening to BBC broadcasts secretly before the war turned them into contraband. On those days, she would stand beside the office doorway with a clipboard, her face composed, her posture rigid. And Carter would appear. Not close. Never close. He remained at his post, 30 feet away, patrolling the women's compound with slow, deliberate steps. But she felt him before she saw him. Felt the way the air thickened, the way her breath shortened, the way her hands tightened on the clipboard. Sometimes he'd pass by, pretending not to look at her. Sometimes she'd glance up at the same moment he did, their eyes catching for a fraction of a second. A fraction that felt like a breach of military discipline. Neither smiled, neither dared. But the message in those stolen glances was unmistakable. I remember. You remember. And we cannot afford to show it. Fear took root quietly. For Carter, it began the moment his sergeant called for a meeting. Sergeant Haskins was a man carved from rules. Square jaw, clipped voice, boots that seemed polished even after a day in Texas dust. He wasn't cruel, but he was the kind of soldier who believed discipline held the world together. Without it, war, or worse, chaos. He didn't accuse Carter of anything that day, but he didn't need to. Some of the men are getting too comfortable talking to the women, Haskins said, eyes narrow as knife edges. This isn't a church social. It's a POW compound. Keep your distance. Yes, sir. Haskins paused, studying him. You understand the consequences. Carter nodded, but his stomach tightened. He understood too well. A month earlier, a guard at a camp in Nebraska had been court-martialed for smuggling letters to a German nurse. Another guard in Oklahoma had been transferred to a disciplinary unit just for sitting too long near a fence chatting with a prisoner. The Army didn't tolerate weaknesses, especially emotional ones. Every soldier in Camp Hearn knew the unofficial rule. A friendly gesture is tolerated. A personal gesture is punished. A gift is treason. And Carter had made a ring. For Anna, fear came from multiple directions. Some of the women in her barracks were fiercely loyal to the Reich even now, stern, bruised by loss, clinging to ideology because it was all they had left. To them, America was a humiliation they would never forgive. To them, kindness was manipulation. And to them, any German woman who softened toward her captors was a traitor. Anna was careful. She spoke little. She did her chores exactly. She laughed only when others did first. But whispers traveled quickly in a barracks full of exhausted, displaced women. Twice she caught two of them looking at her with suspicion. Once she heard someone mutter, "Amerikanische Hure," under their breath. She kept her head down. She did not answer back. She knew what happened to women accused of fraternizing with the enemy. She had seen it in France. Women dragged into town squares, heads shaved, paraded for crowds. Fear is not loud. It is quiet. It curls into the ribs, settles in the spine. And then there was the fear of her own heart. She had survived bombings. She had survived hunger. She had survived the shame of surrender. But she did not know how to survive this unfamiliar stirring when she caught his silhouette near the water pump, this warmth in her chest when she heard his voice among the other guards. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something smaller, but infinitely more dangerous, the possibility of compassion for a man she was supposed to hate. Fear grew heavier when an incident from another camp reached Camp Hearn. A corporal returning from furlough brought the news, casually as if discussing the weather. "Did you hear about Camp Concordia? guard got reassigned because he gave a POW girl a piece of chocolate. An inch of chocolate. A trivial kindness. But enough for military command to react. Haskins repeated the story loudly during morning lineup, making sure every guard heard it. He scanned the faces, daring them to betray guilt. And let me be clear. Fraternization is a violation of Article 16, General Order Number 150. You put this camp at risk, you put this country at risk. One infraction, and you'll be on the next train out. Carter felt heat rise up his neck. He didn't look toward Anna. He didn't dare. 30 feet away, she stood stiff, eyes fixed on the ground. But she had heard. She understood. If anyone discovered the ring, even if she had not taken it, he could be court-martialed, imprisoned, stripped of honor and uniform. And if the women found out, she could be beaten, ostracized. Worse, the ring was no longer an object. It was a threat, a secret with teeth. Fear sharpened everything. When Anna came to the admin office to translate, she no longer glanced at him instinctively. Her gaze was glued to the papers in her hands. Her voice stayed level, impersonal. She translated orders with mechanical precision. Carter felt the distance like a physical blow. He had meant the ring as a gesture, a fragment of hope, a reminder that even inside barbed wire, humanity could spark. He hadn't meant to endanger her. She hadn't meant to endanger him. But intentions meant nothing in war. A gesture could be a landmine. Some days fear felt like a third presence between them. Once she dropped a stack of forms, and Carter, walking nearby, took one instinctive step forward to help. One step, one reflex, one breath. Haskins' voice snapped through the air behind him. "Private Carter, eyes forward. Stay in your lane." Carter stopped mid-step. Anna froze, staring at the papers scattered on the ground. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. If he bent to help her in front of the sergeant, he'd be finished. Slowly, she knelt to gather the papers alone. Carter's jaw clenched. He resumed walking his patrol. But that moment did something irreversible. It showed them how fragile this was. How one misplaced act of kindness could shatter both their lives. Another evening, violence nearly erupted in the barracks. Anna returned late from translating duties and found her cot overturned. A message was scrawled on the underside in charcoal. "Traitor." No name, no threats, just that word. But it was enough. Fear slid cold into her bones. She cleaned it quietly, said nothing, told no one. But when she walked past Carter's post the next morning, her posture straighter, her chin higher, her eyes more guarded, he noticed the change instantly. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But something in her silence told him everything. Fear reached its peak one blistering afternoon when the replacement officer arrived. A captain from Louisiana with a reputation for strictness and no patience for soft behavior. He inspected the camp with a sharp eye, checking fences, barracks, guard routines. When he reached the women's compound, he watched the prisoners like a man assessing livestock. "How are they behaving?" he asked Haskins. "Well enough, sir." "You keep them at a distance?" "Yes, sir." "Good. I hear other camps have had issues." Carter felt a chill run down his back. Issues. That was the word military men used when kindness crept where it wasn't allowed. The new captain continued. "A guard allowing himself to get friendly with a POW is a danger. Emotions cloud judgment. I don't want to see any guard standing too close to these women. You hear me, gentlemen?" "Yes, sir," the guards answered in unison. But the captain wasn't finished. "One look at the wrong time, one misplaced smile, and I'll remove you from this camp so fast your boots won't hit the ground." Anna stood among the women, listening. She did not need perfect English to understand. Carter stood at attention, staring straight forward, every muscle locked. 30 feet separated them. But the real distance, the fear, stretched wider than a gulf. Both of them knew. A glance could cost him his career. A whisper could cost her safety. A ring, if discovered, could destroy them both. War teaches people to fear the enemy, but sometimes the greatest fear is not the enemy at all, but the dangerous, forbidden human connection that refuses to die even when the world demands it. Kindness came quietly to Camp Hearn, so quietly that Anna didn't notice it at first. It wasn't some grand gesture, not a speech, not an apology for the war. It came in little things, small mercies, Texas mercies. The first time she truly understood this was on a morning thick with humidity. The women were being moved from the mess hall to the laundry shed when the wooden door jammed on its hinges. The guard nearest, Corporal Jim Ward, a soft-spoken man whose accent curled warm like the sun, stepped forward, lifted the door with one hand, and held it open. "After you, ma'am." "Ma'am." Anna froze for half a second. No German soldier, no SS officer, no Luftwaffe superior had ever called her that. Not in the tone Ward used, respectful, natural, like the word belonged to her. She murmured a soft, "Thank you," instinctively, and hated herself for how strange it felt to say it in English. Ward tipped his hat. "Welcome, ma'am." And then he stepped aside as if nothing unusual had happened. But it was unusual. It shook something inside her chest. A few days later, the ranchers arrived, the civilians who had contracted prisoner labor for harvesting, fencing, and cattle work. They rode in on battered trucks and mud-streaked boots, their voices rolling with slow Texas drawls. One of them, a cowboy with crow's feet carved deep from sun and laughter, overheard Anna trying to say, "Thank you" again, her accent stiff, vowels too sharp. He chuckled, gently. "No, ma'am," he said. "Not like that. It's, thank you. Let your tongue relax." He showed her, stretching the word like taffy. "Thank you." She tried again. Yeah. His grin widened. "You'll get it. Texas'll teach you sooner or later." The way he said it made the other women smile, even laugh. Real laughter, not the brittle kind that war had carved into them. Laughter in a POW camp. Who would believe that? The question the women always whispered finally burst out one afternoon when a young prisoner named Elise, braver than she felt, asked a guard, "Why are you so kind? We are the enemy." The guard, a freckled kid from Tennessee who couldn't have been more than 20, looked up, genuinely confused. "Ma'am, that's just how we were raised." Just how we were raised. The simplicity of it stilled the room. Anna had no response, because in Germany, kindness was strategy, something you offered only when it benefited the Reich. Kindness had conditions, consequences. But here it seemed woven into the soil, the sky, the way Texans spoke to strangers. Kindness wasn't earned here, it was given. Camp Hearn itself reflected that spirit, and day by day it pulled the German women into a different world. The camp library was small but real. Rows of books donated by local families, everything from Mark Twain to farming manuals to well-worn copies of Shakespeare. Anna found herself staring at shelves as if they were relics of a forgotten country. Books had been burned, censored, banned back home. Here, a POW could read whatever she wished. The radio played American music in the evenings, Bing Crosby's gentle crooning, jazz riffs that fluttered like dragonflies, war updates delivered in crisp American English. Sometimes the women sat close just to feel the vibrations of songs they had never heard. There was a vegetable garden run by the prisoners themselves, a canteen where they could buy soap, needles, postcards, a mess hall that served meat, potatoes, milk, every day. Milk, Anna had not tasted real milk since 1942. Here she drank it every morning. Abundance was as shocking as kindness. And all the while, the unspoken connection between her and Private Samuel Carter deepened, not in words, but in moments. When she passed his guard post, he always shifted slightly, as if bracing for something he could never admit he wanted. Their eyes met only in flickers, but those flickers said more than conversations ever could. Once, during evening roll call, she let herself look at him a second too long. He looked back. Something warm passed between them, quick and trembling. Another time she sneezed from the dust, and he quietly laid a handkerchief on the fence post nearest her, pretending he had simply dropped it. She pretended she believed him. It was that kind of tenderness, a tenderness shaped by restraint, the kind that hurts because it cannot be expressed openly. Then came the night he left her a note. A small piece of paper, torn from a ration booklet, tucked between the fence wires. "Keep warm tonight. It's cold out." She found it during laundry duty. Her breath caught in her throat. He had written it knowing full well the risk. One piece of paper, one, could have ruined him. Yet the handwriting was steady, strong. He hadn't second-guessed the words. That night she placed something in return on the same post. A small square of cloth torn from an old uniform, embroidered with the outline of a horse. Not a German horse, not a military emblem, a Texas horse. She had seen one up close the week before and had spent the evening sewing its shape into fabric, unsure why. Now she knew. It was a thank you, a confession in stitches. When Carter found it, he didn't touch it at first. He just stared, long enough for another guard to call out, "Something wrong, Carter?" "No, sir." He tucked it into his breast pocket like something sacred. The war continued beyond the fences, of course, loud, brutal, unforgiving. But inside Camp Hearn, life was shifting. Not toward peace exactly, but toward a gentler kind of coexistence. The American belief in the Geneva Convention wasn't just legal, it was cultural. They treated prisoners as humans because to treat them otherwise would have betrayed the nation they believed in. "You feed people right, they behave right," one guard often said, and he was right. The German women, stunned by decency, worked harder, argued less, even smiled more. One night, long after lights out, Anna heard music drifting from the guards' barracks, someone playing guitar. The melody was slow, lazy, unmistakably Texan. She lay awake listening to every note, letting it wash over her like warm water. She didn't recognize the song, but she recognized the feeling it carried. Home. Not her home, but a home. A feeling she hadn't tasted in years. The ring, the one he had first offered her in a moment of fear and impulse, had not been forgotten. But she did not know the truth of its making. Only Carter knew that. He had fashioned it from a scrap of aluminum shaved off an old training aircraft in the maintenance shed. He'd stolen the metal during his night shift, pocketing it like contraband. Over 2 weeks he carved it down with a file, smoothing the edges, polishing it with an oil rag until it gleamed. Every night he worked on it alone, beneath a hanging bulb that hummed faintly. Every night he thought of her face. Not smiling, he had rarely seen her smile, but thoughtful, fierce, brave in ways she didn't know she was. He didn't intend it as a marriage proposal, not really. It was a message, a declaration. You are not invisible here. Not to me. When he first held it out through the fence, he had been terrified. When she touched it, even more so. But now, under the dim barracks light, he held the finished ring in his palm again, turning it slowly. It was simple, flawed, but warm with meaning, a symbol of everything he could not say aloud. He wanted to give it to her properly, not through wires, not in fear, but he didn't know how, or when, or whether fate would give them the chance. Kindness is rarely loud. It whispers. It accumulates. A door held open, a lesson in pronouncing thank you, a handkerchief, a note, a scrap of embroidered cloth, a ring made in secret beneath a bare bulb. And in Camp Hearn, Texas, far from Germany's ruins, far from America's battlefields, kindness grew in the most unlikely of places, between a cowboy-born American soldier and a German prisoner of war. A kindness fragile enough to fear, tender enough to hope, strong enough to survive the barbed wire between them. For now. It happened in the span of a heartbeat, in the sliver of time between courage and catastrophe. The sun had slipped beneath the horizon, leaving Camp Hearn washed in the soft blue of early dusk. Evening duty was almost over. The German women were finishing laundry detail, preparing to return to their barracks. Carter was making his final round past the fence line, his steps slow, measured, pretending not to look for her but hoping every second that she might turn her head toward him. And she did. Anna stepped closer to the fence, her breath catching when she saw him approach. There was no one else around except a single guard in the distance. The air smelled of warm soil and fading daylight. In her hand, she held the embroidered cloth he'd given her back in return for his note. She meant to give something back again. He knew the risk. She knew it too. But sometimes longing is stronger than fear. Carter reached into his pocket. He withdrew the aluminum ring, shining faintly, polished smooth, warm from his body heat. "Anna," he whispered, her fingers curled around the wires. He extended his hand, slipping the ring through the gap just enough for her to take it, not forcing her, not asking for anything more. A simple offering, a simple mistake. Before she could touch it, a voice cracked like a whip through the night. "Private Carter, step away from the fence." The ring dropped onto the dirt. Anna jerked her hand back as if the wire had burned her. Carter stiffened, blood draining from his face. Sergeant Haskins came storming across the yard, boots pounding the earth, fury carved into every line of his jaw. 2 other guards followed behind him. He had seen everything. Anna took one step back, then another, until she collided with the other women. Their faces twisted instantly. Shock, then disgust, then whispered accusation. Traitor. The word didn't need to be spoken aloud. She heard it in the way they breathed. Haskins seized Carter by the arm. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Private?" Carter didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only stared at the ring glinting on the ground. Haskins followed his gaze. His expression darkened further. "Pick it up," he barked at one of the guards. The ring was lifted from the dirt like evidence of a crime. Haskins held it in front of the Carter's face. "You stupid son of a... Do you have any idea what you've done?" Carter finally found his voice. "Sir, it isn't." "Shut your mouth." Anna stood trembling on the other side of the fence, feeling as if she were drowning. "Please," she whispered. Haskins snapped toward her. "Not another word out of you." The guards escorted her back to the barracks immediately. Carter was dragged toward the admin office, and the ring, the fragile, dangerous thing that connected them, was clutched in Haskins' fist like a weapon. The interrogation room was small, lit by a single harsh bulb. Carter stood at attention while Captain Aldridge, stone-faced, rigid, reputation for zero tolerance, read from a typed report. "Gifting contraband to an enemy prisoner. Unauthorized contact. Violation of fraternization orders. Then he lowered the paper and looked Carter in the eye. What were you thinking, son? Carter swallowed hard. Sir, Don't lie to me. Haskins stepped forward. I caught him offering her a ring. A ring he made, sir. Aldridge slammed the file shut. You compromised security, he said coldly. No, sir. You shared classified information? No, sir. Never. Did she manipulate you? The question hit harder than a slap. Carter's voice sharpened. No, sir. Aldridge studied him closely, trying to read the truth beneath the soldier's steady composure. Then what? He asked. Exactly were you doing? Silence burned between them. Carter's jaw clenched, his hands tight at his sides. And then, in a quiet voice that cut deeper than shouting ever could, I just saw her as a human being, sir. The room froze. Haskins looked away. Aldridge exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was the wrong answer politically, but the right answer morally. The kind that made American viewers, decades later, swell with pride at the dignity of a soldier who spoke from conscience rather than regulation. Yet, conscience wouldn't save him. Aldridge's voice returned to steel. You've put your career at risk. You've put this camp at risk. The war isn't over. Our boys are still dying in Europe and the Pacific, and you're giving jewelry to a German prisoner. Carter said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew the consequences. Aldridge closed the file. You're lucky I'm not court-martialing you, but you will not remain at this camp. The verdict fell like a hammer. You are being transferred to Camp Swift effective tomorrow morning. You will have no further contact with any POWs from this facility. Carter's heartbeat faltered, but he nodded. Yes, sir. For Anna, the punishment was immediate. She was pulled from the women's barracks before dawn and escorted to a small isolation hut at the far end of the compound. No sunlight, no conversation, no translation duties, no work detail outside the fence. The women who once shared meals with her now refused to meet her eyes. One spat at her feet as she passed. Another hissed, Amerikanische Verräterin, American traitor. Inside the hut, she sat alone on a metal cot, her hands trembling in her lap. Not because of shame, not because of punishment, because she had not been able to reach through the fence one more time, because she had not been allowed to tell him she hadn't meant to endanger him, because she hadn't said goodbye. That hurt more than the isolation. Hours later, a guard finally brought food. Before leaving, he murmured, He's being transferred tomorrow. Her breath left her body all at once, like she'd been struck. She closed her eyes. Of course he was. Of course, kindness has a price in wartime, and they were both paying it. Carter spent that last night packing his footlocker. He didn't have much: letters from home, a worn Bible, a guitar pick from a friend in his unit, and the embroidered horse from Anna. He folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his uniform. Lights out came, but he couldn't sleep. So he did what every guard did when restless. He patrolled. He walked the perimeter slowly, quietly, as if trying to memorize the rhythm of the camp. The fence loomed silver under the moonlight. The towers hummed with generators. Somewhere far off, cattle lowed softly. And then he saw her, standing at the edge of the women's compound, hands gripping the wires, face pale in the shadows. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she had come anyway. He walked toward her, boots light on the dust. When he reached the fence, he stopped just short of touching it. For a long moment, neither spoke. There were no words big enough. At last, she whispered, "They're sending you away." He nodded. Morrison's being merciful. Could have been worse. She swallowed hard. Moonlight glinted in her eyes like tears waiting to fall. "In another life," she whispered, voice trembling, "we would have had time." He lifted his hand, placing it flat against the wire. Slowly, she raised hers to meet it. Metal separated them. War separated them. But their hands aligned perfectly, only a thin line of barbed wire keeping them from each other. "We had enough," he said softly. "That's more than most." She closed her eyes, holding on to his words like oxygen. Footsteps approached in the distance. Another guard coming to relieve him. Carter stepped back. Anna pressed her forehead to the fence. He gave her one last look, one she would carry across oceans and decades. Then he whispered the last words she would ever hear from him. "In another life. Yes." By the time the sun rose, he was gone. In the days following Carter's departure, Camp Hearn felt strangely hollow. The routines continued: roll call, work duty, mealtime, lights out, but something in the air had shifted. It was as if a quiet echo lingered in the spaces he once walked, a reminder that even in a place built on discipline and fences, a single human connection could shake the ground beneath it. Anna felt it most sharply. She returned to the main women's barrack after 3 days of isolation. But nothing was the same. The women kept their distance, whispering about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Some still looked at her with suspicion, others with pity. Yet none of that weighed on her as heavily as the simple fact that he was gone. No chance to see him, no chance to explain. Only the ring's absence, the memory of his voice, and a question that refused to fade. That night she opened her small notebook, the one she used to write fragments of thoughts, memories of home, and sometimes prayers she no longer believed in. She wrote slowly, deliberately, as though the words might slip away if she rushed them. "They punished him. Not for loving me, but for protecting the rules. And still, they treated us with dignity. What kind of nation is this?" She stared at the page for a long time. The Reich had taught her that enemies were to be crushed, that compassion made a nation weak, that softness meant failure. But this country, this America, had punished the breach of rules, not the impulse of humanity. They defended their principles, not their pride. They upheld discipline without cruelty. It was a contradiction so profound she felt it like an ache in her chest. America punished him, yes, but America had also protected her, protected all of them. And this paradox unsettled her more than any threat ever could. Across the state, over 100 miles away, Carter stood on the dusty parade field at Camp Swift, holding his duffel bag, waiting for assignment. The air smelled different here, pine and red clay instead of mesquite and cattle. The guards around him were strangers. No one here knew him. No one here knew what he had done. And yet, in a quiet way, he felt lighter. He had no regrets. None. Standing alone by the fence at dawn, watching the women line up for roll call, he felt something break open inside him. A truth he hadn't been able to name until he'd lost her. She was my enemy only on paper. The war had stamped a label onto her, onto all of them, but labels didn't change the human heart. She was a daughter, a sister, a frightened girl far from home, shaped by propaganda she never asked for, and he, born in Texas, raised on values older than the war, had done the one thing that war could never erase. He saw her, not as a German, not as a prisoner, as a person. He had crossed a forbidden line, yes. But if compassion was a crime, he could live with it. What he couldn't live with was hatred, for hatred had taken enough from the world already. That spring, American newspapers carried news from the Pacific that shook the country. The Battle of Iwo Jima had ended. Tens of thousands dead. Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, a photograph that stirred the entire nation. Weeks later, reports from Okinawa filled the headlines. Casualties so heavy the ink seemed to bleed grief onto the page. Every American family felt the war in their bones. Mothers prayed over empty dinner tables. Wives slept with unopened telegrams tucked under pillows. Sons marched into battle with the weight of the world on their shoulders. The nation was tired, wounded, yet strong in a way the world would never forget. Perhaps that was why the treatment of German prisoners was so remarkable. Because even in the midst of carnage, even with losses piling up like storm clouds, Americans held to a principle older than the war, older than the country itself. Human dignity did not belong to the winners. It belonged to everyone. While American soldiers bled on the beaches of Iwo Jima, German prisoners in Texas were fed warm meals, given medical care, offered books and music, and a chance to breathe freely. While fathers buried sons, American guards still said, "Yes, ma'am," to the daughters of their enemies. While telegrams shattered homes across the Midwest, a cowboy-turned-soldier risked punishment to show kindness to a woman raised to hate him. It was a kind of moral victory the world rarely recognized, an ethical strength far quieter than explosions and far deeper than military triumph. What a nation! What a generation! Anna felt the weight of that realization grow inside her with each passing day. She heard the news of Iwo Jima through the camp radio, the announcer's voice solemn, almost reverent. She heard about the valor of American troops, the unimaginable losses. And she saw something she had never expected: American guards mourning their own while still treating prisoners with respect, never lashing out, never holding their grief against the people behind the wire. That alone shattered something old and rigid inside her. If the roles had been reversed, if German guards were grieving fallen comrades, would they have still shown mercy? She knew the answer. She had lived the answer. One evening, sitting on her cot with the thin barrack light flickering above her, she whispered to no one, "They are better than we were told, better than we were." It was not self-hatred. It was awakening, a kind of painful clarity that made her feel small and humbled. She thought of Carter often, not with longing but with gratitude. He had shown her the heart of America in the way he looked at her, spoke to her, protected her even when it cost him everything. In her diary she wrote, "He saw what the war tried to erase, not a uniform, not a nationality, a person." And beneath that, in smaller, shakier letters, "America wins more than battles. It wins by kindness." At Camp Swift, Carter sat alone on a bunk in his new barrack listening to the nighttime chorus of insects and distant coyotes. He held the embroidered cloth she had given him, the little horse she stitched with careful hands. He traced the outline with his thumb, remembering her face, the way she had whispered goodbye. He didn't know where she was now, didn't know if she was safe, didn't know if she ever thought of him. But he knew one thing with certainty: war could break rules. War could break nations. War could break hearts. But it could not break the simple, powerful truth he learned in Camp Hearn. Humanity belonged to everyone, even enemies. He would carry that lesson for the rest of his life. He looked at the cloth one more time, then folded it gently and placed it beneath his pillow. Tomorrow he would stand guard over different prisoners in a different place. But something inside him had changed forever. And somewhere in Camp Hearn, a German woman was writing in her diary. Words he would never read, but words that belonged to him too. They punished him for breaking rules, but they never punished him for caring. America is a strange, beautiful nation. In that shared awakening, unspoken, separated by miles but united in truth, both of them understood something the war could never take away. Compassion had survived the barbed wire. Kindness had survived the uniforms. Humanity had survived the war. And in that, there was victory. The order came in early spring, announced by a lieutenant reading from a clipboard in the middle of the compound. The war in Europe was ending. Repatriation would begin within weeks. The German women would be among the first groups sent home. Home. The word did not feel real. For many of them, home was rubble. For others, graves. For some, nothing at all. Anna stood still as the wind picked up across Camp Hearn, carrying dust, the smell of bread from the mess hall, and something else, something like finality. She touched the thin cord around her neck, hidden beneath her blouse. The aluminum ring hung from it like a tiny weight, warm against her skin. She had never worn it on her finger. It was too dangerous, too bold, but she kept it close enough that her heartbeat passed through it every day. Now, as the lieutenant read their names, she closed her hand over the ring and whispered to herself, "It's time." Departure day came with a pale Texas sunrise. The women were loaded onto trucks, escorted down the yellow country roads lined with wildflowers and wooden fences stretching toward the horizon. The air smelled of grass and cattle, of earth and warmth. Nothing like the gray, broken air she remembered from Germany. When they reached the port, the Liberty ship waited like a giant steel shadow on the water. Its hull was weathered from the war, but it stood steady, ready to carry them back to a land they no longer recognized. Anna hesitated at the gangway. Behind her, America stretched wide and bright, full of life and possibility. Ahead of her, Germany waited, scarred, starving, ashamed. She stepped forward slowly, gripping the cord around her neck. The ring thumped softly against her chest with each step. When she reached the deck, she turned just once to look back. The coastline of Texas glowed in the morning light. Fields rolled gently toward farmhouses. The sky was impossibly open, and she felt tears rise, unbidden, stinging her eyes. The land that fed me, the land that showed me kindness. She whispered it under her breath, unsure whether she meant it for herself or for the man who had taught her what kindness truly meant. The ship's horn bellowed, a deep, mournful cry, and the vessel began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily, cutting through the water as the coastline shrank behind it. Anna stood at the railing, hands gripping the cold metal. She watched until Texas was only a line, then a speck, then nothing. But she did not feel empty. She felt full, achingly, painfully full, with a mixture of sadness and gratitude so deep it almost hurt to breathe. The voyage back to Europe was quiet. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. On the final night, Anna took out her notebook. The pages were worn, corners bent from being turned over and over. She wrote carefully, ink skipping slightly with the swell of the ship. America was the first place I felt safe, the first place I breathed without fear, the first place I was treated like a person, not a tool of war. She paused, letting the memory of Camp Hearn wash over her, the mess hall steam, the guitar songs drifting at night, the library that smelled of paper and hope, the guards saying, "Yes, ma'am," even to enemies. And him, always him. She touched the ring again, closing her eyes. It felt heavier now, as if it carried every mile between them. I was supposed to hate them, but I cannot hate a nation that showed me kindness." She let the notebook fall shut. Germany appeared on the horizon days later. Gray skies, gray water, gray land. The docks were broken. Buildings stood like hollow teeth along the shore. People moved slowly, hollow-eyed, as if even hope had been rationed and used up. The women disembarked in silence, boots clicking on splintered planks. As Anna stepped onto German soil, the cold struck her immediately. Not just the wind, the atmosphere. Hunger hovered in the air. Grief soaked every wall. Nothing here resembled the life she had known before the war. A Red Cross officer handed her a small ration pack. Another directed her toward a processing line. She looked around at the ruins, at the faces worn thin from years of deprivation. Texas felt like another universe. She slipped her hand beneath her collar and held the ring tightly. For the first time since arriving back in Germany, her breath steadied. A woman beside her noticed the gesture. "You lost something?" she asked. Anna shook her head gently. "No," she whispered. "I kept something." Weeks turned into months. Germany struggled to rebuild. Streets cleared, slowly. Families searched for missing sons. Everything was scarcity. Coal, bread, hope. Yet every night before she slept, Anna held the ring in her palm. She remembered the guard who risked everything to give it to her. She remembered the nation that fed her when her own could not. She remembered the strange, impossible chapter of her life lived behind American fences, but free in ways she had never been before. Years would pass. Her hair would silver. Children would grow. Cities would rise again. But she never removed the ring from its cord, never once. Another life came, peace, marriage, work, family, but the ring stayed, not as a symbol of romance, not of longing, but of awakening, of the moment she realized that humanity could exist even between enemies, that compassion could outlive war, that America, distant, flawed, enormous, had kept a piece of her heart, and she had carried it home. 60 years later, on a quiet autumn afternoon in a small town outside Hamburg, a man named Lucas Fisher found a wooden box at the back of his grandmother's wardrobe. The hinges were rusted, the lid warped with age, the grain darkened by time. It looked like something meant to be forgotten, yet carefully preserved. He carried it to the kitchen table and brushed away the dust. When he lifted the lid, the faint scent of old paper drifted out, mingled with something sweeter he could never quite identify, perhaps the memory of a different life. Inside lay 3 objects: a small notebook, edges frayed, filled with neat German handwriting, a square of cloth embroidered with a horse, simple, precise, lovingly stitched, and a ring of dull aluminum tied to a faded cord. Lucas stared at the ring. It was humble, uneven, shaped by hand, but it radiated something quietly powerful. "Grandmother," he whispered, opening the notebook. "What did you carry all these years?" He began to read. The entries stretched from 1944 to 1946, written during captivity and the first months after her repatriation. Some pages described the war's chaos. Others described hunger, fear, and the uncertainty of a world collapsing. But most were about Camp Hearn, about the guards who said, "Yes, ma'am," about the meals, cornbread, milk, fresh vegetables, about the library and the radio music drifting through warm Texas nights. And then, woven through the diary like a secret thread, came the story of a man. An American soldier, a cowboy with gentle hands and sincere eyes. A guard who had seen her as more than an enemy. A man who risked punishment to show kindness. Lucas stopped reading when he reached the words she had written the night before leaving Texas. America saved my humanity. Not through softness, but through dignity. Not through weakness, but through strength. He exhaled, shaken. He knew the broad strokes of history. He knew his grandmother had been a POW in Texas. He'd heard whispers of the American camp when he was a child, always spoken with surprising fondness. But he had never known this. He had never known there had been someone, one man, who changed the course of her life with nothing more than decency. His hands trembled as he lifted the embroidered cloth. A horse. A Texas horse. Beneath it lay the ring. He picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. It wasn't beautiful, but it was extraordinary. The metal was worn smooth from decades of being held, touched, treasured. It was a relic, not of romance alone, but of awakening. Later that evening, Lucas sat with his daughter, a curious 12-year-old named Clara, who loved history almost as much as she loved asking questions. She pointed to the ring. "What's that?" He sat beside her, placing the ring in her palm. "It's a gift," he said softly, "from an American soldier." Her eyes widened. "To Oma." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the wooden box, the diary, the stitched horse, the ring, symbols of a life shaped not only by war, but by one act of courage and kindness. "Because," he said, "America saved my grandmother's humanity." Clara touched the ring with reverence. "How?" He smiled gently. "By treating her like a person when the world told her she was an enemy. By feeding her when she was starving. By seeing past her uniform. By being strong enough to be kind." Clara turned the ring over in her fingers. "People weren't like that during wars," she said. "Some were," Lucas replied. "Americans were." She looked thoughtful. "Are they still like that?" Lucas hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? As he packed away the box that night, he couldn't help comparing the America of his grandmother's diary, the America of 1945, with the one that existed now. Back then, America had been bruised by war, but united in purpose. A nation that rationed sugar but gave prisoners bread. A nation that lost sons in Iwo Jima and Okinawa but protected the dignity of German captives thousands of miles away. A nation held together by a quiet understanding of morality, by neighbors who believed in fairness and duty, by farmers who fed strangers, by soldiers who enforced rules but never forgot compassion, the greatest generation. They worked, they sacrificed, they disagreed, but they stood together. Today's America felt different, divided, cynical, suspicious of one another. The factories that once built ships and aircraft lay quiet. The unity that once carried a nation through war seemed fragile, slipping through modern fingers like sand. His grandmother's diary felt like a letter from a better world, a world where Americans were strong without cruelty, where patriotism meant responsibility, not anger, where kindness was a mark of character, not weakness. And that comparison, gentle, unspoken, heartbreaking, brought tears to Lucas's eyes. Not because he mourned for Germany, but because, strangely, he mourned for the America his grandmother had loved. Before closing the box, he read the final page of her diary again. They were enemies by war, but America made them human again. He whispered the words aloud. Then he added something of his own, an inscription written on a fresh piece of paper and placed atop the relics. Wars end, but American kindness leaves a mark that lasts generations. Clara looked up at him. "Papa, what will happen to the ring now?" He tied the cord gently and placed it around her neck. "It will stay in our family," he said softly, "so we never forget what America did for us." She held the ring to her heart. And in that moment, 60 years after a cowboy guard risked everything for a woman behind a fence. The legacy lived on, not in monuments, not in medals, but in the quiet truth passed from one generation to the next. Compassion is stronger than war, and kindness is a nation's greatest victory.